Right, so hi everyone. Apologies, I am clearly not Mike Wild, Macc, Chief Executive. Mac's called in sick today, so I've been asked to stand in at the last minute, so lower your expectations a little bit. I have quite short notice, and I'm going to do my best, so I'll tweet him later and go, hopefully it went okay. So I'm Claire, I work at Macc on the Policy and Influence team. I'm our strategic lead for collaboration, so thanks for coming to the Voluntary Sector Assembly here today. We're going to talk about working with young people, but just to go through a bit of housekeeping stuff first. Just to say thanks very much to our partners at Manchester Mind and the other partners who are going to be presenting and delivering workshops today. As usual, the Voluntary Sector Assembly, it's about bringing together loads of different organisations from across the sector and looking at how we really share that knowledge and bring people together, so it's certainly not something that we do on our own. Again, apologies for Mike, he's not well, so if anyone wants to tweet in and give him a little wave and say, "Get well soon, Mike," I'm sure he'll appreciate that, because knowing Mike, he's keeping an eye on things from his sick bed. In fact, he sent me a message to share with you all, which I will do in a little bit. Just to remind you about the toilets and the fire escapes. There's very handily a little piece of information on the paper there. But the toilets, as you come out of these doors and turn left through the double doors, the gents are on the right-hand side and the ladies are a little bit further around the corner. They have been clearly marked. There's no fire alarms or anything planned for today. Hannah, can you just read, what does it actually say on there? I can't remember about where to meet. There is. It's on there.
If the alarm goes off, front car park, same for bomb alert.
Front car park. So if the alarm goes off, there's no drills planned for today. We'll meet at the front car park, and we've got the sign-in sheet for everybody as well. If anyone does tweet, please use the hashtag. It's Manchester MCR and then capital VSA. As usual, for a lot of organisations, particularly the smaller ones, it's quite difficult to leave the office for a full afternoon. So we do always get a lot of feedback that people do follow the tweets from the office. And normally the conversation carries on Twitter for a few days after the actual event as well. So please drop us some tweets, let us know who you're talking to and what are your kind of main learning from the day. But also use it as a network, a real opportunity to network and have a chat and meet other people as well. Like I said, Mike does send his apologies today. And I've got to admit, to my shame, I did have a moment of panic this morning when I was asked to host and do the opening speech instead of Mike, because my first response immediately was, I don't really know as much as I should about youth work. I'm not a youth worker. I don't know a huge amount about youth organisations across the city. If you'd asked me to open a talk around the integration of health and social care while working with hospitals, I'd be all over it. And then immediately, within a second, I was like, that's actually part of the problem, because with conversations like this, similar to the climate emergency that's recently been declared, we tend to think it's about youth work and youth organisations, and it's not. It's about everybody. It's about the entire sector, and it's about the entire city, and it's about every single organisation, our responsibility and how we work together. So I'll do that in a minute. So it's about how we nurture and support the future generations. How do we do that? What are we already doing, and what's our role? And Manchester is a really young city. I'm out of this age bracket now, unfortunately, but 40% of the population is under the age of 35. But 1 in 3 young people and children are living in poverty and growing up in poverty in this city that's just been announced again as one of the most livable cities in the UK, at the same time as our health outcomes are one of the worst in the UK. So what's going wrong there, and how is the growth of the city actually impacting upon young people? And is it? And so today's event, I'm not used to using notes, so bear with me. It's a bit more about the things that happen across the city. I'll talk you through the agenda in a minute. We've got a great lineup of people who are here to share their expertise, so really do join in with the conversation. Especially now I'm really pleased that we've got Young Manchester here as well, who are doing so much to join things up across the city. So we'll be hearing from Justin and the team later on as well. The message that I've got from Mike, which I will read to you if you don't mind. He says, in recent weeks there's been serious reflection on how our sector is embracing changes in communities. In particular, the Charity So White conversation, which some of you may have seen on Twitter, is forcing us, long overdue, to think about how reflective we are of our communities and how we challenge hidden discrimination in our own sector. He's wondering, is there a bigger question that young people who are wanting to drive social change and make a difference simply don't see charities as the place where that can happen? So today needs to be an opportunity to think about how young people are involved in what we do. How many of us recruit young trustees? How many have youth volunteering opportunities, work experience, learning opportunities? And we're looking at what we can do at Macc to encourage and support young people to get more involved in shaping social action across the city. So I want to have a real conversation about inclusion as well today, and how inclusive it is in involving young people and how they will shape the city in the future. So that's a bit of a challenge from Mike for us all to think about today as well. A couple of other things I want to say before we move on. We've got Manchester Mind here today. We're delivering this in partnership with them. And happy birthday, Manchester Mind. 30 years old this year. 30 years of delivering this kind of help and support and change across the city. Absolute massive achievement. So happy birthday, guys. Also, it's a bit of a massive year this year. It's the 80th birthday of Citizens Advice Manchester. It's also the 30th birthday of Y-In. And in the next few weeks, Wood Street Mission are going to celebrate 150 years of being active in the city. So it's just showing the legacy of the sector and voluntary action across our city. And this year as well, Macc, and along with our partners at Salford CVS, celebrated 100 years of this kind of social action and working collectively across Manchester and Salford. So there's a huge legacy of things that are going on across the city. Also, something to keep an eye out, we've got our Spirit of Manchester Awards coming up on the 3rd of October. Is anyone coming to the Spirit of Manchester Awards? Make sure you follow that on Twitter as well. How long is it, Cheryl? It's only about 3 weeks, isn't it? Is it?
2 weeks tomorrow.
2 weeks tomorrow? I've not got a dress yet. So we'll all be there, follow the conversation, keeping an eye out on following the theme of Spirit Manchester as well. Next week we've got our Spirit of Manchester Stories Week that Helen's leading on. This one again is focusing on the climate emergency, and again saying it's not just about environmental organisations and food growing schemes, it's about everyone and everything and how we respond to the climate crisis that we've got at the moment. So if anyone's doing anything or they've got a story they want to share, get in touch with Helen. And just to say as well, people may have noticed NCVO, the National Council for Voluntary Organisations, have got a new chief executive. So Carl Wilding started in the chief executive role just yesterday, and today he's up in Manchester visiting organisations in Manchester and across Greater Manchester. So I think it's really nice to see that he's getting out of London literally on his second day in post and finding out what's going on up north. So I'll be catching up on that conversation on Twitter later on as well. So as usual, the whole team, is there an honour from Macc? Give us a wave, please. The team are here today, there's quite a few of us. If you need anything, let us know. The agenda for today, we've got Manchester Mind. Kevin's going to join us in a second, talking about the scene setting, what youth services support nationally, what challenges do we face. Kevin's going to lead over to Justin from Young Manchester, talking a bit about their work, in the future in the city. We're going to go for a break. This is the bit where it all goes a little bit wrong, when we need to get you from your break to the 3 separate workshops. So before the break, after Justin's finished, I'm going to bob up again and just remind you which workshop it is you've actually signed up for and which room it's in. And again, the staff will be happy to direct you to make sure that you end up in the right place. And then we'll be rounding you up again to come back here. I'm really excited we've got Becky from Reclaim talking about young people and youth leadership and what impact that's having on the city, and that's really important. And then we're going to finish up with a bit of the national perspective. We've got Paul Schofield from DCMS who's going to round us up at the end of the day. We're going to finish for about 4:30. So we'll crack on. I'll hand over to Kevin. Thanks so much. Oh, and sorry, photos. If anyone, Hannah here is filming and taking photos. If anyone doesn't want the photos to be shared, just grab her later on today and let her know, and we'll make sure that we pick those out, the ones that we've taken. Thanks, Cheryl. All right, I'll hand over to Kevin. Thanks, everyone. Have a good day.
Thank you. Hello, Manchester. Are you ready to rock? I'm sorry, I'm not Mike either. I'm Kevin Jones. I'm the manager of the Children and Young People Service from Manchester Mind. And I'm also a youth worker and have been for at least 25 years, depending on where you measure it from, possibly longer. And it's fallen to me to set the scene for the afternoon by talking to you a bit about just some personal reflections on youth work and youth services, how we got to where we are today, and some of the challenges we face. So I want to set a couple of parameters. The first thing is I will be talking about services for young people generally, but I'll also be talking about youth work specifically and separately. And there's a few reasons for that. One is that I'm here and I get to talk about stuff that interests me. And I'm fascinated by youth work, and I'm fascinated by youth work history, so any opportunity to bang on about it, I'll take. The second one is that I think that youth work and its kind of sister profession, community work, do have stuff about them that's unique, and stuff that I think is very, very valuable, and I want to expand on that a little bit later. And also because I think nationally the changes in services for young people that have happened over the past few years have largely been due to changes in the youth work landscape. And so I'm going to talk about sort of how those changes in the youth work landscape have had an effect on youth services and services for young people generally. So, good. Why is youth work unique then? Well, for me, it's the only service that begins with the engagement of and the development of a relationship with its clients. Engagement comes first with youth work and with community work. You develop that relationship, and then the work programme sort of emerges from that. It comes from the expressed needs and the exploration that you do with those young people. And so I think that's important, and it's something that makes youth work very, very different, and we don't shout about it enough. Also, I'd like to say that engagement doesn't come from a set of magic engagement skills. This is something that I think a lot of people who are youth workers and people who work with youth workers seem to think youth workers have. We have these magic kind of engagement skills. And I don't know what those would be. I don't know whether those skills, I mean, communication's in there, obviously, humour, empathy. But these aren't skills that are unique to youth work. These are skills that a nurse should have or a social worker should have. So the idea that there's a set of youth work skills that are a unique part of youth work and not relating to other stuff, I think is something we need to think about a little bit. Which doesn't mean youth work isn't unique. I'll get on to how youth work is unique later. So no, the ability of youth work to engage doesn't come from a set of magic skills. It comes from a set of processes and a set of ways in which youth workers work, and the settings that it takes place in, and through attention to the power relationships between the youth workers and the young people. That's, I think, how youth workers are successful engagement workers. So what are those processes that facilitate this engagement? Well, there's been a lot of thought about that, and a lot of ways to sort of attempt to try and define youth work. I'm going to refer to a sort of fairly recent definition that comes from an organisation called In Defence of Youth Work, and they've come up with a set of cornerstones. If anyone knows In Defence of Youth Work, they'll know that a few people on the steering group are quite wordy and quite, you know, they enjoy a sentence or two. So I'm going to summarise them a little bit, because otherwise we'll be here all day. So the first one, the first principle, and this is in the context of how youth workers engage. So the first principle is the primacy of the voluntary principle, the idea that a youth work relationship is a voluntary one. Young people can join it as they wish, they can leave as they wish, and that changes the way that you work. It means that your work has to be relevant to the young person, it has to be engaging, and it's important. There is some debate about whether the voluntary principle is sacrosanct. So can youth work take place in a place where the relationship isn't voluntary? Can it take place where there's an element of compulsion? I'm not going to get into that. Some people would say it can, some people would say it wouldn't. I would say that without that voluntary relationship, or if that voluntary relationship has changed, then engagement becomes a little bit more difficult, and I'll leave it there. The next cornerstone is a commitment to conversations with young people which start from where they are. They start from their concerns and what life's like for them. So if you're a youth worker, you spend a lot of time working out what people like, what they don't like, what's important to them, what they enjoy doing, what they're worried about. And so straight away, again, you can see how that improves engagement, because what you're doing is you're beginning with what people are interested in and what matters to them. The third cornerstone is about the importance of association, the importance of young people being part of a peer group, part of a family, part of a community, part of a neighbourhood, and the effects that those associations have upon them. And again, so the example that I'll come on to later about where youth work has gone, moving into casework divorces the young person in some ways from those relationships and from those ways in which those relationships affect them. And so yes, I wouldn't say that makes youth work impossible. I think you can do youth work with individuals. But I think if you're ignoring the relationships that they have with their peers and with their families and with their society, then again it makes that engagement a little bit more difficult. The next thing is a commitment to value young people here and now. Young people are transitioning into adulthood, they're transitioning through education, they're going into employment, all that sort of stuff. But youth work works with them as they are now. They are citizens, they have an effect on society, and they're affected by it. And that's where youth work starts. And again, if you're working with young people around engagement, then they're often interested in where they are now. They do have interests about where they're going, but if you're going in and going, I'm going to work with you as a potential employee or as a potential non-criminal, then you're setting the agenda. And so again, I would argue that that makes engagement a little bit more difficult. Excuse me. The next cornerstone, there's 3 more of these. Next one's an insistence on democratic practice. What that means really is youth workers work in a way that's empowering. They work in a way where young people have some influence over the process and the content of the work, which means they can influence it, which again facilitates engagement because they've got some control over the process and the outcome. The next one is about intersectionality. It's about the fact that young people aren't homogenous. You can't look at one young person and say you're just like this one. Young people are affected by things like class, race, gender, sexuality, and youth work is attendant to that and realises that all these different influences have an influence over that young person's development and their experience. And then the final one is about the significance of the youth worker themselves. Because youth work is a relationship-based practice, the personality and the characteristics of the youth worker are important, much more important than would be in a lot of other practices because of this negotiated democratic back and forth that takes place with the youth worker. And so it doesn't mean you have to have the right personality to be a youth worker, but you have to know what your personality is. You have to know how that's affecting the practice, which is why reflection is so important. It also brings to the practice a little bit of an improvisatory sort of way of working. There's a friend of mine who works for Newman University who's written a whole thesis on the similarities between the youth work relationship and improvisatory jazz. He's a jazz musician as well, so he's worth looking up. But it's an interesting part of the profession that there's that back and forth, and your personality is important. So those are the cornerstones. Those are, I'd say, a good indication as to how youth work is good at engagement and how it does engagement in a different way and possibly an easier way to any other profession, and why other professions that don't operate in these ways may find engaging and keeping young people engaged a little bit more difficult than youth workers do. What it does suggest, though, is that if you're getting youth workers to work in partnership with other professions, those professions need to know that the youth worker doesn't necessarily have magic skills, but that the processes that they go through are the ones which support engagement. And that's something that youth workers can do, I think, in their liaisons with other services. Anyway, so where are we up to? I want to take a second look at work based from engagement and how it's some of its characteristics. The first thing is that work based from engagement presents youth workers with a bit of a problem, in that because the outcomes of the work emerge from the engagement, it's difficult to say what's going to happen before you're working with the young person. So you can't say, I'm going to work with this young person, I'm going to get them into a job, if the work is emergent from engagement. And so stating what your outcomes are going to be is problematic. It's not impossible, but it's problematic. And so funders with an interest in youth work need to be quite brave if they're going to take a punt on it. They need to accept that there's this level of sort of improvisatory and emergent practice. It also makes it difficult for funders who've got a specific interest, say in crime reduction or in health promotion, to take a punt on youth work. And so those conversations are quite interesting and problematic ones to have. Having said that, there is a massive value to engagement. Engagement, I think, is really important and something that we do need a service that is an expert in. It's important for information. If you're spending a lot of time working with a group of young people or young people in society, you're finding stuff out about them and about their likes and about their dislikes and about their communities that you wouldn't necessarily find if you weren't working in such an engaging way. If you get that involved with people, you become what a friend of mine, Graham Tiffany, describes as a privileged witness of social reality. So you do get under the skin of communities and under the skin of young people in a way that other professions don't necessarily do. And that's worth something, that's valuable. Not just to youth workers, but to our partner agencies as well. The other thing is you gain trust. If you're working with young people in this way, you gain the trust of them, which means that you can push them a little bit further. You can walk with them to places that might be a little bit uncomfortable, and they can depend on you to do so because you invested that time in that relationship, and that's valuable as well. An example of that, I'm going to be very brief with this, but it's there's a really nice example of a youth project that sums all that up. And it's in the J report, which was the report about the Rotherham sexual abuse scandal. And it talks about a project called Risky Business. So Risky Business was a detached youth project. And they were working with some of the girls who were being exploited out on the street. And they invested time, they developed relationships, they spoke to them. And a few things happened as a result of that relationship that I think really summarises what's good about youth work and engagement work. First of all, they started getting information. So these girls flagged up the fact that they were in these odd and difficult and abusive relationships with taxi drivers and with whoever else. They wouldn't give any firm information, but it was soft information that was raised the alarm bells of the project workers. So they went to the police and informed the police. The police weren't used to getting information that was kind of this soft either, but they acted upon it and they took it seriously. So that was an example of how that relationship, first of all, raised a concern for another agency that could then be acted upon. The second thing was, as a result of that, obviously there were charges made and a criminal justice process gone through. Those girls were able to stay engaged in that process because they had youth workers with them who they trusted and they had a relationship with, to walk with them through it and to hold their hand through it. And so they stayed with that process, and as a result there were sort of 5 arrests made as a direct result of the work with risky business. And so this engagement work with the fact that youth work is good at engagement is important and it's valuable, and it's not something we should lose because it's difficult to quantify. So that's my bid for engagement and my bid for youth work being unique. I'm going to spend a little bit of time now talking about how we've got to where we are historically. So youth work's got at least a 200-year history. It goes back to the ragged schools and all of that. But the modern youth service, as many of you know, and I will be brief because I'm sure you know a lot about this, began in Britain, or was sort of crystallised in Britain with the Albemarle Report in 1960. Now the Albemarle Report defined what youth work was in a way that I've just done with the Cornerstones, not dissimilar to that at all. It invested a huge amount of money in training workers. It set up a college to train youth workers for the first time ever. It built centres dotted around the country. There's these Albemarle youth centres that youth workers look upon fondly. And it outlined that the local education authority should include youth services as part of their provision. So all of that happened during the course of the 60s, and then that's the shape of the youth service as it was pretty much till the beginning of 2000. Every education authority had a youth service, they had youth workers, they had street work, they had centre-based work, and it was seen as part of local authority provision. The only real serious change to that happened in 2002 with Transforming Youth Work, which was a document published by the Blair government. And in typical Tony fashion, what Transforming Youth Work did was it was good, the times were good, so money was promised. But money was promised only if he could get his fingers into it and manage it a little bit. And so what came along with Transforming Youth Work was a need for youth workers to sort of say what they were doing and to measure what they were doing in terms largely to do with getting people into employment and training. So the term NEETs came up then, not in education, employment and training. The idea of accredited outcomes came up. A certain percentage of the people the youth services had to work with had to get an accredited outcome. And so AQA made an awful lot of money by coming up with lots and lots of different courses to accredit stuff. I have an accredited outcome for independent toileting, which I'm quite pleased with. But what it did was it very subtly changed the way in which youth workers related to their work, because they were going in now with this agenda. In reality, a lot of the time they didn't. They did youth work and they said they got accredited outcomes and that was kind of tagged on. But in terms of how they define themselves, I'm generalising enormously, how they define themselves to their other partners in different services and to government and to funders, they'd sort of fallen into this thing about kind of, yeah, we can get people into employment. That's one of the things we do. And that's, I think, took something away from us shouting about us being experts in engagement. So that was a reasonable change. And the reason I think it was significant, shortly after that, there were a few other changes that happened. Services were beginning to be squeezed. There was a drive for integrated youth support services. I don't know if people remember those, where youth services were integrated with social care or integrated with social services. An increase in casework, so again, divorcing young people or divorcing the work from young people's relationships with their peers in society and that sort of stuff. And in amongst all of this, in 2008 came the global financial crisis and the crash of 2008, and austerity followed thereafter. Alexei Sayle recently described austerity, I don't know if you heard this, as the idea that the global financial crisis was brought about by there being too many libraries in Wolverhampton. And if you were in the youth service, it felt a bit like that, with services being cut left, right and centre. It's kind of, this wasn't our fault, you know. In reality, the cuts to youth service, and they were dramatic, So from 2008 to now, the youth service nationally has lost 2/3 of its revenue from local government. So it had a budget of just over £1 billion pre-2008. It's now down to 388 million. So it is a dramatic cut. In reality, there wasn't really a government policy about getting rid of youth services. Youth workers are often kind of, oh, it's the Tories. There wasn't a government policy for it. Local authorities, and you can see by the different reactions local authorities have had around the country, in some ways were left with no option. Their funds were cut. Youth services did have a statutory basis, but it was a very, very sketchy one, and they had responsibilities for social care and for education that they couldn't mess around with. So youth services seemed to be an obvious thing for them to cut. The upshot, though, is this dramatic reduction in service and a change in the shape of how youth services are delivered across local authorities across the country. So, what's the new shape of services then? Well, what's happened, many areas, and Manchester's one of these, lost their youth service completely. They lost the central hub and they lost their statutory youth workers. And what that meant was that there wasn't one point of contact for youth workers and for youth services, for partner agencies to liaise with. The slack was often taken up through commissioning budgets and third sector providers. And I'll get on to what that's done to services in a second. The second thing was a rise in commissioning of services. So very few local authorities just got rid of their services and said, we're not going to do that. Many of them closed their service down but had a commissioning budget. And this meant that the third sector all of a sudden was asked to jump through hoops, to state that they were going to meet some outcomes, to work to short-term contracts, all of that sort of stuff. It changed the landscape for the third sector providers quite dramatically. And so the third thing is that as a result of the decline in youth services, much more of the provision of youth work was delivered by a disparate and diverse third sector in competition with itself for funding. So not in a system that encourages partnership or sharing of knowledge, but one that encourages people to bid against each other, if you like. And the way that these were organising themselves in terms of coordinating their work and communicating with each other were often disparate as well, through a bunch of different organisations that were set up in neighbourhoods, and again were sort of in competition with each other. So this is what we're in at the moment. Oh, they're not in every local authority, they all differ. But the landscape has moved from having well-funded, well-coordinated central youth services to this disparate, well-skilled, but uncoordinated third sector. So this presents us with a few challenges. How do we, as a sector, coordinate our work, given that there are pressures to be in competition with each other often? How do we as a sector liaise with other relevant services, so health, education, crime, social care, housing? How as a unit do we have those conversations, and how do those services communicate with us as a unit, as youth service providers, rather than having to communicate with individual service providers? How do we work with funders from all areas? So how do we work with commissioners, how do we work with grant funders in a way that shares our local knowledge and our local relationships and our local skills that we've gained through this engagement work that we're so good at, and gets resources to where they are in a way that they can be delivered effectively, rather than delivered by the one organisation that's desperate to keep its funding. So these are all challenges that we're facing. How do we keep and capitalise on our local knowledge? How do we continue to work in ways that promote engagement in a landscape that's moving us more towards promoting outcomes and promoting saying what we're going to do before we've had that engagement? So those are the challenges that we face. The new landscape does give me some hope, though. Engagement and relationship are firmly back on the agenda with funders and partners. Health, education, crime, social care all recognise the importance of engagement and engagement work. Funders do as well. And that's encouraging to me. I think that's a source of great hope, and there's work we can do there. The second is we're recognising the importance of locality and community and family. There's an awful lot more locality-based work and work that's multidisciplinary, that's based in neighbourhoods. And that's a great step forward, I think, and encouraging. And the third thing is the third sector providers are good, we're skillful, we're valued by other services, more so I think than perhaps we were when the youth services were there. People recognise that in this room there's a bunch of organisations who know what they're doing, who have good local knowledge and have a good set of skills to work with. So, I hope that today gives us an opportunity as providers to think about how we can organise ourselves around these strengths and around these opportunities. And I hope you have fun. I'm going to hand over to Justin now, who hopefully is going to give us some insight into what we're doing in Manchester to do that.